"You're not my father, so stop acting like it." The words hit me harder than I expected, even though they shouldn't have. It wasn't the first time Damien had said something like that, but the bitterness in his voice still cut deep. I stood in the doorway of his room, holding a plate of untouched dinner, my knuckles whitening as I gripped the edge of the plate. "I'm not trying to be your father," I said carefully, my voice quieter than I intended. "I just thought you might be hungry." Damien didn't look at me. His back was to the window, where twilight painted long shadows across his room. His silence wasn't new, but tonight it felt different, heavier. When I married Celeste 2 years ago, I thought I was prepared for everything that came with being a stepfather. I knew Damien, then 16, wasn't thrilled about having someone new in the family, but I told myself I could handle it. What I didn't anticipate was how much of an outsider I would feel, even in my own home. Dinner was always the same. Celeste tried to keep the conversation light, but it was like navigating a minefield. Damien's responses were clipped, and when he did speak, it was usually to ask to be excused early. My attempts to connect, whether through sports, school, or even casual jokes, were met with a wall of indifference. Celeste reassured me often, saying, "It's not you, Adrian. He's just adjusting." But 2 years felt like a long adjustment period, and I wondered if this was simply how it would always be. Tonight, the divide felt especially stark. Celeste had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, leaving just Damien and me in the house. I thought maybe, without her as a buffer, we might find common ground. Instead, it felt like the walls were closing in. I glanced around Damien's room as I set the plate down on his desk. His space was like a fortress. Clothes draped over a chair, posters of bands I didn't recognize covering the walls, and a stack of books and video games that were clearly his escape. "Look, Damien," I started, trying to sound steady. "I know this isn't easy for either of us, but I'm not here to make your life harder. I want us to get along." He finally turned, his dark eyes meeting mine with a look I couldn't quite read. "You think you can just come in here and act like we're family?" he said, his voice sharp but quieter than before. "You don't even know me." He wasn't wrong. I didn't know him, not really. I knew the surface-level details. He liked playing the guitar, he hated math, and he could spend hours lost in a book. But I didn't know what made him tick, what he was afraid of, or what he hoped for. And maybe that was a problem. Damien sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't have to try so hard. I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped, the way he avoided looking at me for too long. There was something simmering beneath the surface, but I didn't know how to reach it. As I walked back to the kitchen, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something, some key to unlocking whatever it was that kept Damien at arm's length. The house felt eerily quiet without Celeste, the faint hum of the refrigerator the only sound as I washed the dishes. Later that night, I passed by Damien's room and noticed the plate was empty. It wasn't much, but it felt like a tiny victory. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to bridge the gap between us. Standing there in the hallway, I resolved to keep trying, even if it felt like I was walking in circles. Damien didn't have to see me as his father, but I wasn't ready to give up on the idea of being someone he could count on. For now, though, I would have to settle for the small wins, like an empty plate left on a desk. Little did I know, the days ahead would force us both to confront choices that would change everything. "It's not broken, it's just jammed," Damien muttered, crouched next to the cabinet. "You've been pulling it the wrong way." I stood over him, arms crossed, feeling equal parts frustrated and impressed. The drawer in the hallway credenza had been stuck for weeks, but every time I tried to fix it, I only made it worse. Now, Damien had stepped in unprompted and managed to loosen it with nothing but a screwdriver and sheer determination. "Well, I guess I'll have to start calling you the handyman around here," I said, trying to lighten the mood. Damien didn't laugh, but the faintest smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. He slid the drawer open with a flourish, as if to show me how simple it had been all along. "Not everything needs brute force, Adrian," he said. I chuckled, caught off guard by the rare use of my name instead of his usual, detached you. It was a small thing, but it felt like a crack in the icy wall between us. We sat on the floor for a moment, surrounded by the contents of the drawer, old receipts, a jumble of keys, and a few random knickknacks. Damien sorted through them absently, holding up a keyring with a raised eyebrow. "You keep all this stuff, but do you even know what half of it is for?" he asked. "Probably not," I admitted, leaning back against the wall. "That's the thing about getting older. You collect things without realizing it, and before you know it, you're hanging on to stuff that doesn't mean anything anymore." Damien tilted his head, as if he were considering the weight of my words. "Yeah, I get that," he said quietly. The vulnerability in his voice caught me off guard. He wasn't just talking about the drawer. He was talking about himself. I hesitated, unsure whether to press further. "Damien," I said finally, "is there something you've been holding on to that you don't need anymore?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into the pile of clutter and pulled out a small, rusted key. He turned it over in his fingers, his expression unreadable. "This," he said, holding it up, "this was for a bike my dad gave me when I was 10. It broke years ago, but I kept the key. I don't even know why." Hearing him mention his dad always put me on edge, but this time there was no anger in his tone, just a quiet sadness that seemed to settle in the space between us. "You kept it because it mattered," I said gently. "Even if the bike's gone, the memory isn't." He nodded, his gaze distant. "I guess," he murmured, "but sometimes it feels like holding on just makes it harder." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. You don't have to let go of everything to move forward. Some things are worth keeping, if they still mean something to you. For a moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the hallway clock. Then Damien surprised me. "You know, I'm not mad at you for being here," he said, his voice low but steady. I didn't ask for this. For a new family. For you." His words weren't accusatory, but they were honest. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I know," I said, "and I never wanted to replace what you had. I just wanted to be here, however you need me." Damien looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time, I felt like he saw me as more than an unwelcome intruder in his life. "Thanks," he said, almost too softly to hear. The moment passed quickly, but it left a warmth in its wake. As Damien stood and started putting the drawer back together, I realized this was the first real conversation we'd had. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't erase the tension between us, but it was a start. By the time the drawer was fixed and the hallway was clear, Damien had retreated back to his room, but he left the rusted key on the counter, as if it no longer needed to be hidden away. That small gesture stayed with me as I turned off the lights and headed to bed. It felt like a step forward, however tentative. Little did I know, the key wasn't just a piece of Damien's past. It would soon become a symbol of a decision that would shape both our futures. "I've decided I want to meet him," Damien said, his voice steady but hesitant, as though he was still testing the weight of his words. I looked up from the kitchen table, my coffee halfway to my lips. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting soft shadows on the walls. For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. "You mean your dad?" I asked carefully. Damien nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Yeah, I've been thinking about it for a while, and I need to do this." The words hung in the air between us. I set my coffee down, my heart tightening. Celeste and I had talked about this possibility before, but hearing it from Damien himself was different. He was so composed, so resolute. It wasn't the angry teenager I'd known 2 years ago. "Does your mom know?" I asked, breaking the silence. "I told her last night," Damien replied. "She said she'd support me, but I could tell she wasn't thrilled about it." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. "What about you? What do you think?" I took a breath, trying to organize the swirling thoughts in my head. "I think if this is what you need to do, then I support you too," I said slowly. "But I'm not going to lie, Damien. It might not go the way you hope." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I know, but it feels like this weight I've been carrying. I can't move forward until I know why he left, why he just disappeared." The sincerity in his voice was undeniable. This wasn't a whim. It was something he'd been wrestling with for years. "Do you want me to come with you?" I offered, unsure of what his answer would be. Damien hesitated, then shook his head. "No, I think I need to do this alone." I nodded, respecting his decision even as it left me uneasy. "All right, but if you change your mind or need anything, you know where I am." The conversation ended there, but the weight of it lingered. Over the next week, Damien prepared for the meeting, tracking down his father's address and rehearsing what he wanted to say. Celeste and I stayed out of his way, offering support when needed, but giving him the space to handle it on his own. The morning of the meeting, Damien was quieter than usual. As he stood by the door, adjusting the strap of his backpack, I could see the nervous energy in his movements. "Good luck," I said, my voice steady. "Thanks," he replied, pausing for a moment before adding, "And thanks for being here. You didn't have to, but you were. That means something." The door closed behind him, leaving me and Celeste in a heavy silence. Damien returned later that evening, his face unreadable. I resisted the urge to barrage him with questions, instead letting him come to me when he was ready. Finally, he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands clasped in front of him. "It wasn't what I expected," he admitted, his voice low. I stayed quiet, letting him set the pace. He apologized, Damien continued, said he wasn't ready to be a dad back then, and by the time he realized his mistake, it felt like too much time had passed. He said he regrets it, but he trailed off, staring at his hands. "But what?" I prompted gently. "But I don't know if I can forgive him." "Not yet," Damien said, his voice trembling. I thought hearing him say sorry would make it better, but it doesn't erase everything. It doesn't change how I felt growing up. I nodded, understanding the complexity of his emotions. "That's okay," I said. "Forgiveness doesn't have to happen all at once. It's a process, and it's on your terms." Damien looked up at me, his eyes searching mine. "It made me realize something, though," he said. "Family isn't just about blood. It's about who shows up. And you've shown up, Adrian, even when I didn't make it easy." The words hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I didn't trust myself to speak. "I'll always show up," I said finally, my voice thick with emotion. Damien nodded, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Damien seemed lighter, more at ease. He still had moments of distance, but the tension that had defined our relationship was gone. One evening, as we cleared the dinner table together, Damien handed me something. It was a rusted key he'd found in the drawer weeks ago. "I don't need this anymore," he said simply. I turned the key over in my hand, understanding the unspoken meaning behind the gesture. It wasn't just about letting go of the past. It was about making space for the present. For the first time, I felt like we weren't just coexisting in the same house. We were family,